When they asked me to speak here at Zeitgeist, I was absolutely delighted because I said I've actually got a theory of everything which I'd like to present. So if you like, you can cancel Stephen Hawking tomorrow. And they said, actually, if it's all the same to you, we'd rather you did some funny stuff. This, by the way, is the curse of the fat man. You know, I imagine Buddha got this happening all the time. Can we just have a bit less about enlightenment and a few more mother-in-law jokes, maybe? What I thought I'd do then, since I'm at the heart of perhaps the greatest and most successful engineering culture in the world, is tell a few engineering jokes, but as a byproduct of that, make a useful point, which is that one of the unfortunate byproducts, I think, of the digital revolution is our ability to process and communicate that which is numerical, sequential, rational, proportionate, and intuitive has leapt ahead of our real understanding of human psychology and human nature. And so there's a kind of imbalance that's created, which in many cases leads to inefficiency in the value creation that businesses can actually achieve. So if you go on to the first slide, here we go. What we're creating, or we're in danger of creating, is businesses, the boards of directors of which are almost exclusively drawn from a finance, engineering, management consultancy background, whose entire Weltanschauung is based on rational, mechanistic models of how the world works, and effectively boards of directors where marketing on human psychology in its broadest sense has no representation at all. Women would be quite an easy way, actually, of injecting some of this understanding into boards. So we're creating organizations which are slightly Aspergic or Anorak Inc., in that they have absolutely fantastic numerical and technical skills, but their human skills are decidedly limited. It's a bit like that joke about how can you tell an extrovert actuary when he looks at you, he doesn't look at his shoes, he looks at your shoes. Now, Anorak Inc., what I'm not suggesting, by the way, and this is very important, is that inordinate and extraordinary human progress hasn't been made by the application of these engineering sciences. I'm a creative person myself, but when I fly on a plane, I don't want to think that the people who check the wheel nuts are wildly imaginative people. And let's just try, anti-clockwise just for once. It feels right. Okay? But what I think is important is there are certain elements where the belief in perfectly efficient markets, the efficient market hypothesis, neoclassical economics, let's face it, if you're paid £4 million a year, it's quite difficult not to believe in efficient markets, isn't it? After all. There's every incentive to believe they're true. Is there something slightly odd about this? It's working now. What you have to understand is that actually one of the obsessions is complete efficiency. But if you actually look at human psychology, we don't like extreme efficiency very much. Evolution exhibits, for example, the peacock's tail, which is a deliberate display of waste. That some form of waste is a way of actually believably communicating that you have resources to spare, and we instinctively trust organizations and people who have resources to spare. It's why actually Caesar in Shakespeare says, "Let me have men about me that are fat." In that, someone who isn't desperately hungry and needy, someone who doesn't have a very short time horizon, someone who isn't desperate, is more likely to engage in long-term rewarding exchanges with you than someone who has very, very immediate needs or a very short time horizon. Someone like, for example, a crack addict or the head of the IMF. And so what peacocks do, is they actually demonstrate their available resources through gratuitous waste. What the peacock's tail says, I'm so efficient as a bird that I can carry this thing around on my back for purely decorative purposes and still function as a living organism. And basically this works with humans as well. It's why, if women were simply attracted to people with expensive vehicles, they'd all chase lorry drivers. Unfortunately, the lorry has no symbolic value because it actually has a practical purpose, whereas a two-seater sports car in London does the job of demonstrating available resources absolutely beautifully. Now, in the old days, businesses used to do quite a bit of this, and I liked it, I must say. This was effectively how Chrysler demonstrated its financial strength in 1929 or thereabouts, and this is how they do it today. And I think we can all agree we're much better off for it as a society. I'd much rather the money was spent on accountants and annual reports than absolutely magnificent architecture. So great success there for the mechanistic brigade, and I think we can congratulate them all. But there's a fundamentally dangerous primacy of mathematics over psychology that actually Charlie Munger, Warren Buffett's bridge and business partner, makes this point brilliantly. If economics isn't behavioral, I don't know what the hell is. Very, very fair point. But the danger is that actually people fell in love with certain models of existence because the mathematics were so goddamn elegant. And actually, they'd almost prefer to actually adhere to the mathematics than the reality. The danger is that this is now, we talk about this quite a bit at the microeconomic level in terms of behavioral economics. We talk about it at the macroeconomic level in terms of financial breakdown. But there's also a median level, which is that level of business thinking and decision making, which at the moment is most peculiarly affected by graduates of the business schools of 15, 20 years ago, who were generally absolutely devout adherents to perfect market models of how things work. So what I'm just going to do is show that whereas perfect markets are pretty good, I'm actually a devotee of the cool markets hypothesis. I don't think they're perfectly efficient. I think markets just achieve things that are actually pretty cool. What you see in this culture clash is effectively what all of us experience when we go and get our car repaired, which is what happens when an engineering culture comes face to face with a human culture, which is you stand around feeling like a complete idiot while other people stand around whistling and looking at pornographic calendars. Broadly speaking, there is a disparity between the people who are good at this stuff and the people who are good at human-facing stuff. And actually, all I'm saying is that some form of redress wouldn't be actually unwelcome. Here's a game you can show to show that also engineers have other unfortunate side effects. If you take 5 university faculties and you've got to actually detect where the terrorists are found, actually, Islamic studies comes a very, very distant second. Engineering, far ahead of the game. Actually, it seems that Osama bin Laden did a civil engineering degree in '79. Umar Farouk Abdul Muttalib was actually a mechanical engineer. Mohammed Atta was an architectural engineer. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed got his degree in mechanical engineering. And 2 of the 3 founders of Lashkar-e-Taiba behind the Mumbai attacks were actually professors at the University of Engineering and Technology in Lahore. Now, in Bayesian terms, this is far more significant than ethnicity or even religion in spotting these dangerous people. In fact, I don't know why we needed to invade Iraq. A simple drone attack on University College London would probably have done the job. Also, it means you can actually get rid of unfortunate things like racial profiling at airports. You just ask, before you're going through the X-ray thing, what did you do at university? Engineering? Right, marigolds on. Right, now, a group of sociologists, Gambetta and Hertog, asked why this is. It's not because you need technical engineering skills in order to build explosive devices. These people mostly weren't in execution. They were in management and strategy. The reason is, it said, there's a particular mindset among engineers which actually absolutely despises ambiguity and compromise. Because you're driven in an intellectual culture which believes everything has to be precise, numerical, and perfect. As a result of which, you're inordinately drawn towards absolutist models of anything, whether it be religion or economics or anything else. Your horror of ambiguity and compromise effectively drives you this way. Now, studying economics as an amateur, just as an advertising person, I discovered a few interesting people who actually happily dissent from the sort of neoclassical, perfectly efficient view. Interesting Austrian guy, Ludwig von Mises, is the first and most useful person. There's a group of Austrians called, very interesting, because a school of economics which grew up at the time of Freud. So it is intimately preoccupied with psychology as effectively the grounding force of economics. And one of their absolute points is that basically value is subjective. Now, Marxists don't believe this. I don't suppose there are many Marxists here, to be absolutely honest. But most people actually accept this logically, but most businesses find it unbelievably difficult to really accept that there isn't an objective measure of the value of what they do, that it entirely depends on the mindset, frame of mind, frame of reference of the person doing the buying. Ludwig von Mises makes the point, actually, there used to be a bunch of French economists called the French physiocrats who believed that the only form of genuine value you could create was when you extracted something from the land. So quarrymen and shepherds were creating value, but if you went and took the wool from the shepherd and knitted it into a woolly hat, you weren't actually creating value, you were just exploiting the shepherd. Now, as he said, this is quite obviously bollocks and completely bonkers. However, he said, most economists make exactly that same category mistake when it comes to understanding the value of marketing or advertising. They effectively think there's value creating in making stuff, and presentation and complementarity and other things are actually a form of sort of bogus value that doesn't count. Von Mises' great point is, if you're preparing food in a restaurant, you cannot make a distinction or treat as extricable one from the other the value created by cooking a meal and the value created by sweeping the floor. one of them is creating the food, one of them is creating the environment in which that food will be most enjoyed. And the two are actually inseparable, and to make value judgments between those two is fundamentally wrong. Now, here's the perfect example.
Freddy's are supposed to be square.
Have any of these diamond shapes gone out?
New Diamond Shreddy cereal. Same 100% whole grain wheat in a delicious diamond shape.
The perfect demonstration that value is to some degree subjective is that sales went up. And if you had time, I could actually show you some of the research in which people claimed that the Diamond Shreddies tasted different. Actually, this was the poster campaign. And following on from that, actually, a bit of debate raged in Canada. It was a bit like a new Coke moment, because Canadians are quite traditional, and many of them preferred the old traditional square Shreddies. So in a very, very Canadian way, they actually arrived at a compromise. But that's the first vital point, is that it's subjective. Now, Ludwig von Mises, interestingly, believed that there was a prior science to economics called Proxyology, which was the understanding of human action and decision-making and how humans act individually in response to different needs and stimuli. He also believed this was a prior science to economics, that actually economics was merely the study of human praxeology under conditions of scarcity. So understanding that to some extent, human behavior and psychology needs to be a prior consideration to economic logic is a vital distinction, not only for governments, but also, I think, for business, which are dangerously biased in one direction. The other thing is decisions are highly contextual. The economic idea of consistency of preference or continuous utility maximization is not believed by Austrian people or by behavioral economists. Fundamentally, what you prefer and what you choose entirely depends on the individual circumstances with which you choose. In my agency, about a week ago, someone wrote in and said, "What's your favorite coffee shop?" And I said, "There's no need to have one." That's a marketer's belief, that we actually have a brand preference that we carry around in our head all the time. We do have a portfolio of acceptable and not acceptable brands we carry around in our head every time. We don't feel it necessary to rank them, because most of the time the circumstances for making that choice simply don't arise. So it's a very interesting belief that research, arguably, market research, arguably forces people to express preferences and rank orders which they don't genuinely believe. Now, one of the great things about contextuality is price is insanely, and value is insanely contextually determined. We have no absolute internal measure of pleasure, the hedon, and none of us has an exchange rate which says, I'm prepared to exchange $3.50 for one hedon. We can't actually make that trade-off perfectly. So what we'll pay for things, a cup of tea at home, maybe 2 pence. A cup of tea on the street, £1.80. Now, it's fair to say it's not 90 times more enjoyable to have a cup of tea on the street than at home. The context determines what we'll pay. But actually, this relativity applies to all areas of human perception, with one weird exception, actually. Here, if you look at this chessboard, what happens? A and B, A is inarguably darker than B. It's one of the dark squares. I don't think anybody's debating that. Until actually, you cover it up and wait 15 seconds, and you actually see that those two squares are exactly the same color. They're exactly the same shade of gray in reality. However, our brains work, and our perception of temperature, heat, pain, pleasure, volume, pitch. Tiny exception is the 1 or 2% of people with perfect pitch. But nearly all our perception is entirely relativistic. Absolute measures, there are virtually none. There you go, back again. Now it is still, even after I've shown you that, it's impossible for you to acknowledge what I just showed you. Here's another example. In the middle, you have an even gray rectangle. But if I change the context, it's now impossible for you to see that as an even gray rectangle. It has to look darker on the right than it does on the left. So our perception, there's a sort of psychophysics is one name for this, is completely relative. Here's another one showing how it affects our perception of size. Now, the point is about these psychological things is I think they provide us with huge solutions to actually create business value through simply better understanding, better human understanding. rather than forever driving down cost or engaged in a sort of tedious, rational battle to improve the efficiency of everything. I also think it provides an opportunity to solve major human problems. This is one of my few great successes, I think. Someone said, how do we get people to finish the course of antibiotics? It causes a massive problem with resistant bacteria when people feel a bit better, so they give up. Don't give them 24 white pills. Give them 20 white pills and 4 blue ones and tell them to take the white pills and then the blue ones. It's a process called chunking. The likelihood that you'll complete the course is vastly higher because any task that's broken down into intermediate objectives is more likely to be completed. This is another one of my small successes through BBDO, actually, and I gave this away in TED. My argument was that all banks, because they're utterly fixated with the idea of individual rational actors in the community, believe that people sit down and make considered decisions to save money. My argument was there are a million opportunities in life to impulse spend, and no one's invented an opportunity to impulse save. In fact, banks make it as difficult as possible for you to impulse save because they like nothing more than actually getting you to fill in 4 forms and sign some things before you can actually save some money. So this is an iPhone app actually created for Westpac in New Zealand, which actually every time you press it, you save $5. So it brings the same impulse to saving as has always existed with consumerism. Relative measures, a brilliant case, a guy from a hotel in Nashville brought me his customer satisfaction statistics and found that virtually every element of satisfaction with the stay in the hotel, the cleanliness, the food, the quietness, the service, the quality of the gardens, the ice sculpture, was actually a factor of how good the check-in experience was. This is a thing called affirmation bias. Charlie Munger, this is the man, Warren Buffett's mate, says the human brain's a bit like the human egg, that once a sperm enters the egg, it closes down and prevents anything entering. Once a first decision, a first impression or prejudice enters our brain, we close down to further stimuli. If you checked in within 3 minutes and had a good check-in experience, your every other perception of that hotel tended to be good. Because you made a decision, this is a good hotel, I'm going to like it, and you looked for affirmatory evidence. If you had to queue 15 or 20 minutes to check in, everything about the hotel was bad. Not just perception of the service, which might be reasonably coloured by that, but actually perception of things like the ice sculpture and the garden. People actually ticking satisfaction questionnaires, if they'd had a 20-minute wait for check-in, were very keen to say that they thought the ice sculpture was shit. Okay? Now, where rationality goes dangerously wrong in business decisions, the 3G auction. Charlie Munger won't let anybody take part in open auctions because he says they turn your brain to mush. It's what's called a Lollapalooza effect, which I won't go into. Now, what was interesting about the 3G auction, the entire thing was predicated on the idea that people would pay for data by the megabyte. What they'd forgotten is that the frame of paying for mobile phone calls was the home phone, where you paid by the minute. By the time data on mobile networks became possible, the frame was the home broadband connection, where incremental data consumption was free. Not understanding psychological frames, their estimation of what you could actually charge for 3G data was insanely high, which led to completely bonkers bids. Interesting case from how you can turn psychology to your advantage. A car firm was going to offer €3,000 off a new car when a little behavioural economist in the team said, are you sure this is the best we can do? They said, well, €4,000 would be better, but we haven't got €4,000. He said, no. Would it be more effective if you offered €3,000 on the trade-in price rather than €3,000 off the purchase price? And these people sat around and they said, well, it's exactly the same, isn't it? Either way, you save €3,000. It's the same if you're an economist. It's not if you're a human being. And sure enough, when they actually tested it, the level of effectiveness of €3,000 on versus €3,000 off was better by such an insane factor that in one country in Europe it accounted for the sales of an extra 20,000 cars in what wasn't a particularly leading brand of car. The reason is the framing effect. €3,000 on €7,000 seems a lot more than €3,000 off €22. A few more. The continued failure of teleconferencing and telepresence is largely also because of a framing effect, because of the brain is relativistic. It has always mistakenly been sold as the poor man's answer to air travel, not the rich man's form of a phone call. It therefore becomes an inferior good. It becomes margarine to the butter of British Airways. It becomes the pager to the mobile phone of, major airlines. And it becomes what you do when you're not really serious about meeting somebody. Instead of the rich man's phone call, it becomes, you know that business with a pager, which is what you gave someone when you didn't trust them with a mobile phone. Being told you can go to a video conference is a bit like saying, well, we don't really trust Sutherland to go to Frankfurt because he'd only raid the minibar and watch a porn film. So tell you what, we'll let him go down to a windowless room in the basement where he can look at a pixelated image of Jürgen for about 20 minutes. Okay? Now, that is where framing effects are absolutely important. Everything only has a value depending on what we compare it to. That's pretty arbitrary. Anybody got one of these? You must admit to it. An espresso machine. So successful, they'll be buying Google in about 15 years' time. The reason is, if you had to buy fuel for your Nespresso machine in a jar like Nescafe, the actual price you pay would be equivalent to paying about £150 for a large jar of coffee, and you would be unable to pay that. Because the coffee comes in little pods, your frame of reference is Starbucks and not Nescafe, and you regard 26p a time as a bit of a bargain. What you compare something to completely determines the human perception of value. I knew that economists were dangerously mad when I read an economics blog discussing Amazon Prime. This is where you pay £20 a year to get free next-day delivery on all your purchases, at least in the UK. And the economists simply looked at the success of this, and they said, well, if it's so successful, offering next-day delivery, why don't Amazon give it free to everybody? Completely failing to understand the psychology that the exclusivity and price of the saving is precisely what gives it its psychological meaning. If everybody can have a discount, it's not a very meaningful discount. If you get a discount through a friend who works at the shop, it's a very meaningful discount. The fact that you pay for this is actually what makes it work. Now, here's another case where research won't tell you this, rationality won't tell you this. I've been trying to get in touch with Spotify and saying $9.99 a month for infinite downloads is a fundamental psychological mistake. The reason is that nobody knows what infinite music's worth. It's like me going to you and saying, would you like to buy my unicorn? You haven't got a clue what price to offer because no one's ever bought one in the past, okay? Bizarrely, create an artificial limit, 180 tracks a month. People go, 180 tracks a month, that's about 15 CDs. I'd normally pay about 100 quid for those. $9.99 seems a pretty good price. That actually the inability to make a comparison can be actually disastrous. And infinity, now no one in research is going to say, I'll do this, but you need to be a bit stingier first. You know, no one logically is going to say, well, actually, let's reduce the utility, but it's vital to understand how business works. Order massively matters to an extent which would defy conventional economists. If you ask people, a single change in a button from register or sign in to continue increased an e-tailer's sales by 300 million a year. The reason being that people are very happy to buy and then register, but they absolutely hate to be made to register before they buy. Rationally, there's absolutely no difference. Psychologically, there seems to be something enormous going on. This is what happens when you actually have different cans on the shelf. If you have a £2 lager and a £1 lager, 67% of people buy the £2 lager. Add the Tesco 30p bargain lager. As I said, I didn't know you could buy lager for 30p. If I did, I wouldn't be here. But nobody buys it, but it drags the whole category down market. Suddenly, 47% of people are buying the Carling. Take away the Tesco stuff and add this premium, I think it's Kronenberg, isn't it? At £4 a bottle, 10% of people buy that, 90% of people buy the Bud, nobody buys the £1 Carling. That's the effect that context has on preference. So the economics idea of constant preference going around as if it's sort of present in our heads at all times is simply mad. Logic won't tell you this, research won't tell you this. How did Red Bull charge 3 times more for their drink than Coca-Cola could charge for theirs? Bizarrely, they made the can smaller, which made us think it was a different category of drink. If they tried to sell that in a large Coke can from the start, I think our actual framing mechanisms might have killed it. Don't sell these cars, by the way, at car shows. Very, very expensive. Sell them at boat and plane shows. You've been wandering around looking at Learjets for a few hours. You go, I'm feeling a bit responsible. I won't buy a quarter share in a plane this year, but I'll have a couple of those. Okay? Best way online to actually sell TV is bizarrely high-end holiday websites. If you've been browsing at holidays for $3,000 or $4,000 holidays for, say, 20 or 30 minutes, suddenly an $800 TV might seem cheap. I suspect there may be some gender wars going on in that particular purchase as well. She's maybe, by this bloody holiday, I'm going to have a massive telly. But that's purely my suspicion. But actually, context determines value in an extraordinary way. But also timing. How do you get someone to give up smoking? Well, French doctors, this is how badly, one of the third great misunderstandings is the belief amongst almost everybody that attitudinal change is a necessary and sufficient precursor to behavioral change. Actually, it's neither necessary nor sufficient. Often, actually, the greatest mistake that the environmental movement often makes is it believes that in order to get the changes it wants to see in the world, you have to convert everybody into a passionate environmentalist just like you. In fact, human behavior and human attitude almost works backwards. Bob Dylan's great phrase in Brownsville Girl, people don't do what they say they believe, they do what's convenient, and then they repent. Something that might be quite pertinent to a leading finance figure at the moment. But actually that's more or less true. Our actions in many cases determine our attitudes. That the brain is less like the Oval Room of the White House, it's more like the press office, issuing hurried post-rationalizations for what actually you decided to do emotionally some moments before. But just to prove how little facts can influence behavior, as a French doctor, you're no less likely to smoke than any other Frenchman. Now, admittedly, being a smoking French doctor probably makes you the sexiest man in the world, so there are, compensatory benefits. But actually, the real way to get people to give up smoking is to tell them to wait until they've got flu. A quit attempt, if you start it with patches when you've got flu or a heavy cold, will be significantly more successful than if you try on January the 1st. But equally, finally, the engineering culture needs to be fought in terms of public expenditure. 24 billion in order to get to Birmingham about 30 minutes faster is not a good trade-off. Engineers have defined the problem entirely in terms of duration. What psychology shows is that duration is spectacularly unimportant to the human memory and the likelihood that you'll do anything again. Put Wi-Fi on the trains, or as I said once before, you could actually have top male and female supermodels serving free Chateau Petrus throughout the journey. You'd save £22 million, and people would ask for the trains to be slowed down. If you're a psychologist, not an economist, the hedonic opportunity cost of high-speed rail is almost unimaginable. Since we actually remember the beginning and the end of an experience and not much the middle, rebuilding the Euston Arch would actually be a much better use of about 1% of the money. And finally, we don't really know whether things are good or bad. Rather like the great story about Mark Twain painting the fence and persuading his friends that it was a great privilege to paint the fence and that they should pay him to be allowed to do it, we should use some of this elementary psychology in things like taxation. So my theory is that taxation is an unmitigated bad to the people who pay it because there's no trade-off. If you make a trade-off in things that are impossible to value, now if you look at it, for example, rich people pay disproportionately more for almost everything. An airliner is practically socialist if you look at the redistribution that's going on in that thing. So the final thing is, people who pay 50% tax, let them drive in the bus lane. If you just institute one or two benefits to an activity alongside a downside, the valuation becomes much more interesting, and you realize how spectacularly subjective this stuff is. Thank you very much indeed.